15th century Europe. Despite the Catholic Church's relentless ban on usury, a power managed to control the entire wealth of the continent without drawing a single sword. An invisible empire that used mounted messengers instead of armies and encrypted ledgers instead of cannonballs. From what flawless logistical network did it derive its power? In this academic analysis, we break away from the romanticized, superficial narrative that views the Renaissance merely as an art movement. We are dissecting the anatomy of a massive supply chain stretching from the Florentine valleys of northern Italy to Geneva, Lyon, Bruges, and London, with forensic precision. The moments when time and space were transformed into financial weapons, the secret mechanisms of the Lettera di Cambio, the codes of Partita Doppia, the double-entry bookkeeping system, and the logistics of collecting papal tithes. All will be laid out on the table with millimetric accuracy. We will examine, through the raw reality of history, the overseas transport of alum from the dark mines of Tolfa, and how 3.53 grams of pure gold reshaped the entire European economy. But before we dive into the inner workings of those silent gears that built Europe, a brief note. Due to our current technical phase, we unfortunately do not have direct control over the advertisements. However, to ensure that your deep focus remains unbroken and that your sleep is never interrupted in the late hours of the night, our primary goal is to take full control as soon as possible and completely eliminate all mid-roll ads. To help us accelerate this process and expand this independent archive, you can support us by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. History is resurrected right now in the minds of those of you listening to these words from different corners of the world at different hours of the day. Leave your own mark on this silent anatomy table by noting down your current geography and time. If you are ready, let's begin. At the dawn of the 15th century, Florence, situated in the central northern region of the Italian peninsula, was less an artistic sanctuary and more an industrial epicenter, churning with the relentless noise of heavy manufacturing and continuous production. The sole determinant of the city's economic topography was the flow rate of the Arno River, which originated in the Apennine Mountains and carved its way through the Tuscan Valley. The river was not merely a water source, it was the colossal mechanical engine of textile production, the largest global industry of the era. The kinetic energy of the water perpetually drove the massive wooden mallets of the wool-beating mills. The true power of the Florin stemmed not from its iconography, but from the state-backed mint's ruthless standardization of its weight and purity. Merchants across Europe knew that a single florin would invariably yield exactly 3.53 grams of gold. This standardization essentially established the florin as the US dollar of the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, in the era preceding the Medici family's ascent to the historical stage. The macroeconomic foundation had endured catastrophic upheavals. The Black Death, which ravaged the continent in the mid-14th century, eradicated a third of Europe's population, yet it dramatically increased the per capita capital for the survivors. However, in order to export these high-quality broadcloth fabrics to European markets and acquire raw materials in return, a standardized measure of value, far transcending the limitations of a barter economy, was desperately required. It was at this juncture that a physical object destined to recalibrate the gears of European macroeconomics was introduced, the Fiorino d'Oro, or the gold florin. First minted in 1252, The florin had achieved the status of Europe's undisputed reserve currency by the 15th century. It weighed exactly 3.53 grams and was struck from 24-carat pure gold. One side bore the lily, the emblem of Florence, while the reverse featured the city's patron saint, John the Baptist. The true power of the florin stemmed not from its iconography, but from the state-backed mint's ruthless standardization of its weight and purity. Merchants across Europe knew that a single florin would invariably yield exactly 3.53 grams of gold. This standardization essentially established the florin as the US dollar of the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, in the era preceding the Medici family's ascent to the historical stage. The macroeconomic foundation had endured catastrophic upheavals. The Black Death, which ravaged the continent in the mid-14th century, eradicated a third of Europe's population, yet it dramatically increased the per capita capital for the survivors. Conversely, Florence's preceding colossal banking dynasties, the Bardi and the Peruzzi, had collapsed in spectacular fashion in the 1340s. Their ruin was the direct result of a sovereign default, specifically the failure of King Edward III of England to repay the massive loans issued to finance the 100 Years' War. The downfall of the Bardi and Peruzzi emphatically demonstrated the extreme fragility of systems where capital was concentrated in a single centralized vault and tethered to the debt of a singular monarch. The transportation of physical gold in wooden chests, escorted by armed guards through treacherous mountain passes and pirate-infested waters, was an excruciatingly slow and lethally perilous logistical operation. The European economy starved for a financial network that was faster, more secure, and entirely liberated from physical weight. It was amidst these ruins and necessities that the Medici family stepped onto the stage of history, destined to architect an entirely novel and decentralized infrastructure, one built upon the transmission of financial data rather than the physical currency itself. The collapse of colossal Florentine banks, like the Bardi and Peruzzi, in the mid-14th century, had left a forensic wreckage in the history of European finance. The fundamental cause of this ruin was the utilization of a singular, centralized vault structure. All capital was pooled in the same reservoir and left vulnerable to the whims of a single political authority, namely, the risk of sovereign default. At the dawn of the 15th century, Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, founder of the Medici Bank, analyzed this financial devastation with an analytical eye and designed a purely legal and bureaucratic armor, rather than a military one, to protect capital. The system established was the first modern holding company in financial history, a decentralized network of branches. Giovanni de' Bicci's corporate architecture was predicated not on the centralization of power, but on the geographical and legal isolation of risk. The Medici Bank was not a single cohesive legal entity. On the contrary, the central bank in Florence executed separate partnership contracts, a commandita, with branches strategically positioned across Europe's major trade hubs. Every branch in Bruges, London, Avignon, Venice, and Geneva operated as an independent legal entity with its own capital, its own ledgers, and its own legal liabilities. The headquarters in Florence served as the majority shareholder, maggiore, in each branch. However, the branch managers, governator, were not mere employees. They were minority partners in their respective branches. By legal design, branch managers were personally liable for the institution's debts with their private assets, whereas the central headquarters only risked the principal it had invested in that specific branch. Thanks to this strict isolation mechanism, if the London branch collapsed due to a localized war or a merchant's bankruptcy, the financial contagion could not cross the English Channel to ignite the main vault in Florence or another branch in Bruges. The risk was quarantined within the borders of its geographic origin. Governing this multifaceted network demanded an ironclad bureaucratic discipline. The partnership contracts granted to branch managers were strictly limited to terms of 3 to 5 years. Upon expiration, all accounts were frozen. The accounting ledgers were dispatched to the rigorous auditors at the Florence headquarters, and the profit and loss balance was recalculated from zero. Branch managers were categorically prohibited by contract from lending to any monarch, nobleman, or cardinal without explicit authorization from the central headquarters. This rule was a ruthless logistical lesson extracted from the collapse of the Bardi and Peruzzi. This geometric holding structure rendered capital invisible, removing the bank from the physical jurisdiction of any kingdom and transforming it into an indestructible accounting network. Yet the primary fuel for this massive apparatus would not be derived from commercial credit, but from the institution that provided the largest and most consistent cash flow of the era, the papacy. In the 15th century, the Catholic Church operated the most extensive tax collection mechanism in Europe. From the frozen hamlets of Scandinavia to the fog-shrouded shires of England, from the Iberian Peninsula to the depths of the Holy Roman Empire, every ecclesiastical district was mandated to remit regular taxes, known as tithes, and Peter's pence, to Rome. However, transporting tons of silver and copper coins, collected in thousands of disparate local currencies, across the Alps and through roads infested with bandits, was a physical nightmare. In 1410, Giovanni de' Bicci executed a strategic maneuver that altered the course of history by financing the papal claim of a former pirate, Baldassare Cossa. Antipope John the 23rd. The dividend from this political gamble was monumental. The Medici ascended to the role of primary administrators of the apostolic camera, the papal treasury. The monopoly on collecting the Church's taxes across Europe fell under the absolute control of the Medici network. The logistics of this papal collection operated as follows. An archbishop in York, England, would collect the regional taxes in the physical form of English silver groats. Rather than dispatching these heavy silver chests on a perilous months-long journey to Rome, he simply deposited them at the Medici branch in London. The London branch would secure this silver in its vault, and in exchange, provide the archbishop with a sealed parchment guaranteeing that the funds would be delivered in Rome. The London branch manager would then send an encrypted letter to the headquarters in Florence, triggering a mathematical reconciliation between the nostro, our, and vostro, your, accounts in the ledgers. The Florence headquarters would immediately pay this sum to the papal authorities in gold florins from its own Italian vaults. The true strategic genius, however, lay here. The silver collected in England never physically travelled to Italy. The London branch utilised this massive accumulation of cash to purchase English raw wool, selling it to the textile workshops in Flanders. Consequently, an immense commercial profit was generated from the Church's money, without ever charging interest. The Medici Bank functioned as a dam, redirecting the flow of papal liquidity. Taxes arriving from all corners of Europe were first pumped into the local commercial arteries of the Medici branches, only converting into numerical settlements in the main headquarters ledgers after months-long cycles. In this process, coins weighing literal tons were replaced by cryptographic accounting letters weighing mere grams, carried in the leather pouches of mounted couriers. The Church had solved its collection dilemma, while the Medici had seized the largest interest-free liquidity pool in Europe. This flawless harmony of corporate architecture and bureaucratic geography forged the steel skeleton that rendered the system invincible. The most insurmountable barrier dictating the commercial dynamics of 15th century Europe was neither the formidable Apennine Mountains nor the turbulent waters of the English Channel. The greatest geographic and economic obstacle was a rigid theological doctrine emanating directly from Rome and the papal seat: usury, the absolute prohibition of charging interest. The scholastic philosophy of the Catholic Church was rooted in the Aristotelian concept, adopted by Thomas Aquinas, that money is sterile and cannot breed. According to this theological paradigm, demanding additional compensation simply because time had elapsed on a loan was tantamount to selling time, a domain belonging exclusively to God. Time could not be commodified. To extract interest was to encroach upon divine property, an offense punishable by excommunication, eternal damnation. However, the continent-wide expansion of the textile trade, the procurement of raw materials, and the financing of armies inevitably demanded a massive volume of credit. For a European economy trapped between the draconian laws of the Church and the market's insatiable appetite for credit, the Medici bankers perfected the most flawless legal loophole in history. The instrument at the heart of this system was not physical currency, but rather a thick piece of cotton fiber paper, inscribed in the encrypted Italian vernacular of merchants, the Lettera di Cambio, or the Bill of Exchange. Legally, the Lettera di Cambio was not a credit instrument or a promissory note. It was a foreign exchange, cambio transaction. The logistical and cryptographic mechanics of the system relied on a complex mathematics of arbitrage, born from the discrepancies in distances and currencies. The only method to legitimize an interest payment was to introduce an element of risk, periculum, and execute the transaction across two distinct geographies using two different currencies. Church law dictated that if a transaction carried the risk of financial loss, the resulting profit was classified not as usury, but as legitimate commercial gain. The mechanics of this flawless apparatus can be examined with millimeter precision through a typical transaction extending from Florence to London in the 1430s. It was a scenario constructed upon four actors: the investor providing the funds in Florence, datore; the Medici Bank drawing up the bill in Florence, prenditore; the Medici branch paying the bill in London, trattario; and the individual receiving the funds in London, beneficiario. A merchant in Florence would approach the headquarters of the Medici Bank and physically deposit 1,000 gold florins into the vault. In return, the bank clerks, utilizing iron gall ink derived from oak galls, would draft that critical document, the Lettera di Cambio, upon which no interest rate was ever inscribed. The document contained a simple directive: to our branch in London. Exactly 90 days following the presentation of this letter, pay the bearer the equivalent of 1,000 florins in English sterling. This specified 90-day period was no coincidence. Between every major commercial center in Europe, there existed a standardized maturity period determined by the physical travel speed of mounted couriers, known as usance. The usance between Florence and London was exactly 3 months. The letter was sealed within waterproof leather dispatch pouches, scarcella, and dispatched via the Medicis' private courier network. The courier rode north from Florence, crossing the Apennines to Milan, then traversing the Alps via the Mont-Cenis Pass to reach Lyon in France, proceeding through Paris to the English Channel, and finally crossing by ship to England. During the winter months, when snow and mud reduced the roads to quagmires and severely impeded the horses' speed, this logistical journey took between 30 and 40 days. Upon the letter's arrival in London and the expiration of the 90-day usance, the London Medici branch would pay the designated amount in the local currency, English silver pence, pence sterling. However, the invisible profit, the interest encrypted within the system, lay precisely at this juncture, embedded in the exchange rate between the two currencies. When accepting the initial 1,000 florins, the Medici Bank in Florence deliberately calculated the sterling exchange rate below its actual market value. Consequently, the merchant was effectively ordered to be paid slightly less sterling in London than he technically deserved. Yet, the cycle was not complete. For capital to fully mutate into profit, the funds had to return to their point of origin, Florence. The recipient in London would never resort to the primitive and perilous method of packing the silver sterling into chests and shipping it back. Instead, he would purchase a new Lettera di Cambio from the London branch, demanding that the funds be repaid in Florence, once again in florins. The exchange rate calculation for this second bill, written for the return journey, operated on an inverted logic. In the return rate from London to Florence, the sterling was consistently overvalued, while the florin was undervalued. When the second letter crossed the Alps and arrived in Florence 3 months later, the initial capital of 1,000 florins, as a result of the exchange rate differentials and the elapsed 6-month period, would emerge from the bank's Florentine vault as, for example, 1,080 florins. This generated difference of 80 florins appeared, on the surface, to be a perfectly legitimate commercial profit derived entirely from the fluctuation of exchange rates between two different nations. In the algorithmic reality of the accounting ledgers, however, this differential was the cost of utilizing the capital for 6 months, a concealed interest rate averaging roughly 16% annually. The system was documented using the method of Partita Doppia, or double-entry bookkeeping. These exchange rate differentials were recorded with precision in the massive, leather-bound ledgers of the Florence headquarters, strictly categorized into Nostro, our account in London, and Vostro, London's account with all columns. Without the word interest ever being penned, these entries translated into colossal profit margins. Should church inspectors audit these accounts, the defense of the Medici bankers rested upon a seamless logic and undeniable commercial reality. During this 6-month interval, a war could erupt in England, the value of English silver could plummet, or the courier could perish on the road. The probability of exchange rate fluctuations and the currency risk, periculum, during this time were borne entirely by the bank. There was no guaranteed return. It was a risk-based currency speculation. Canon law was forced to concede the existence of this risk. Thus, the muscular endurance of horses, the unforgiving geography of the Alps, the travel durations of couriers, and mathematical exchange tables had metamorphosed into a colossal logistical weapon. It was an apparatus that multiplied capital without the fear of excommunication, wherein time and space were engineered into a financial machine. Capital crossed borders merely through written decrees on paper without physically moving, while interest, hiding within the shadows of foreign exchange rates, financed the entirety of Europe. While financial speculation and encrypted accounting ledgers formed the nervous system of the Medici Empire, the physical muscle of this colossal structure relied on a chemical compound extracted from the earth, an absolute industrial necessity. The largest manufacturing sector in 15th century Europe was unequivocally the textile industry. However, washing and weaving the tons of raw wool arriving from England or Spain was merely the mechanical initiation of the process. For the produced broadcloths to transform into a status symbol for the era's aristocracy and bourgeoisie, they had to be dyed in vibrant and enduring colors. It was precisely at this chemical reaction point that the most critical bottleneck of the contemporary production line came into play. Alum, potassium aluminum sulfate. Alum was utilized in fabric dyeing as a mordant, a fixing agent. Dye applied to a woolen thread that had not been immersed in an alum bath could not bind to the fibers at a molecular level. The fabric would bleed its color upon the first wash or rain, rendering it worthless. Consequently, alum was an indispensable, irreplaceable strategic raw material for the textile sector. Historically, European textile centers were supplied with alum predominantly from Anatolia and the Eastern Mediterranean. Specifically, the Fossa mines under Genoese control constituted the continent's main artery. However, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 and the consolidation of the Ottoman Empire's geopolitical hegemony in the Eastern Mediterranean severed this supply chain like a blade. The strict monopoly enforced by the Ottomans over the alum mines and the punitive customs duties levied on Venetian and Genoese vessels pushed the European textile industry to the brink of a ruthless crisis. The dye houses in Flanders and Florence faced the imminent threat of closure. This industrial asphyxiation was entirely redirected in 1461 by a geological discovery in the Tolfa Mountains, situated approximately 70 kilometers northwest of Rome within the borders of the Papal States. Giovanni da Castro, a former dye merchant and papal official, while surveying the region, noticed hills covered in Ilex aquifolium, European holly, a plant typically found surrounding alum deposits in Asia. Subsequent excavations revealed massive alum reserves that were not only exceedingly close to the surface, but also possessed an extraordinarily high degree of chemical purity. The Papal States recognized the immense wealth lying within their own territory, yet quickly realized they lacked the industrial and logistical infrastructure to extract this ore and market it across Europe. This logistical void became the precise point of entry for the Medici Bank. Pope Pius II desperately required immediate liquidity to finance a planned crusade against the Ottomans. In 1466, an unprecedented industrial cartel agreement was signed between the administrators of the Medici Bank's Rome branch and the Apostolic Camera, Papal Treasury. Through this partnership, named the Societas Aluminum, the Alum Company, the Medici secured the absolute operational concession of the Tolfa mines and a continent-wide distribution monopoly. According to the treaty, a fixed royalty would be paid to the papacy for every cantaro, a standard weight unit of the era, roughly 47.6 kilograms, of alum extracted. while the entirety of the remaining logistics and marketing process would fall under the absolute control of the Medici. The mining operation at Tolfa was transformed into a colossal industrial complex where thousands of laborers shattered rocks from dawn until dusk, and the extracted ore was roasted in massive kilns before being dissolved in water-filled cisterns. The true crucible, however, was transporting thousands of tons of this heavy, bulky material to continental Europe. The crystallized alum ores were loaded onto heavy wooden carts and transported under strict security measures to the port of Civitavecchia. There, they were loaded onto massive, high-sided, multi-masted Genoese and Florentine merchant vessels of the carrack type, boasting capacities of 500 to 1,000 tons. The maritime logistics that commenced from this point forward were a brutal struggle against the elements. Heavily laden fleets departed the Tyrrhenian Sea, sailing parallel to the North African coast, where pirate attacks were most intense, navigating the treacherous currents of the Strait of Gibraltar to enter the Atlantic Ocean. The tempestuous waters of the Bay of Biscay, in particular, proved a lethal testing ground for the heavy, alum-laden ships. This maritime voyage, enduring for months, culminated with the crossing of the English Channel and the eventual dropping of anchor in the Zwin Channel of Bruges, Europe's northern textile capital, or at the docks along the River Thames in London. The primary mechanism safeguarding the Medici monopoly was not solely the wooden hulls of their ships or their merchant networks at the ports. This trade was protected directly by a spiritual weapon. Proclaiming that the revenue generated from the Tolfa mines would be utilized for a so-called holy war, the papal authority issued a bulla, targeting all textile manufacturers in Europe. This edict decreed that any merchant, prince, or kingdom purchasing alum from the Ottomans or any other infidel source would face immediate excommunication. The Church's sword of excommunication physically eradicated market competition, branding rival suppliers as illegal and heretical. By orchestrating one of the most fascinating collaborations in history, the Medici Bank had secured the marketing of an industrial product directly through the spiritual sanctions of the Catholic faith. Through the Tolfa mines, the Medici family were no longer merely invisible bankers, arbitrating between exchange rates. They had mutated into physical suppliers, possessing the power to halt or accelerate the production lines of the continent's largest industry. The boiling of dye vats in every corner of Europe depended entirely upon the tonnage carried by the galleons departing from Tolfa, and the price-fixing mandates issued from the headquarters in Florence. Capital, for the first time on such a colossal scale, became inextricably intertwined with mining logistics and religious geopolitics, enforcing absolute subjugation upon the commercial circulatory system of the continent. The flawless operation of the Tolfa alum mines and the continent-wide Lettera di Cambio network had rendered the Medici Bank the indisputable financial hegemon of Europe. Yet this colossal commercial anatomy simultaneously harbored an unprecedented geopolitical weapon. The documents carried in the leather pouches of Medici couriers were not merely encrypted accounting records. Weaving through all the major capitals of Europe, this courier network also functioned as the fastest and most comprehensive civilian intelligence agency of its era, delivering military deployments, court rumors, and diplomatic crises to Florence long before the states themselves were aware. This absolute monopoly over information and capital would inevitably lead to an intoxication of power, and ultimately a direct collision between Florence and the papacy, the bank's most massive liquidity provider. In the mid-1470s, Pope Sixtus IV sought to purchase the city of Imola in the Romagna region, aiming to expand the borders of the Papal States and secure a strategic military base for his nephew, Girolamo Riario. This acquisition required a colossal loan, and the Pope naturally approached the Medici Bank, the administrators of the Apostolic Camera, Papal Treasury. However, Lorenzo de' Medici, presiding over the bank, foresaw that Imola would pose a critical threat to Florence's own regional security and trade routes. Rejecting mere commercial profit, Lorenzo made a geopolitical decree and categorically refused to extend the loan to the Pope. Escalating the situation, he initiated a de facto financial embargo by pressuring other major Florentine banks to withhold credit from the papacy. Yet Lorenzo's logistical ultimatum was destined to be breached by another banking family of Florentine origin lurking within the system, the Pazzi family. Viewing the Medici embargo as an opportunity, the administrators of the Pazzi Bank's Rome branch covertly provided the Pope with the 30,000 ducats required to purchase Imola. The reward for this financial insubordination and political betrayal on the papal front was monumental enough to sever the jugular of the Medici Empire. Pope Sixtus IV officially transferred the administration of the Apostolic Camera, the largest interest-free liquidity pool in the history of banking up to that era, encompassing all tithe and tax collection privileges across Europe, away from the Medici, and into the hands of the Pazzi Bank. The course of that colossal river of silver and gold flowing through the capillaries of Europe had been redirected overnight. The loss of the papal accounts triggered a massive liquidity crisis within the central vaults of the Medici Bank. This financial warfare, ignited by the severing of cash flow, rapidly transcended accounting ledgers and mutated into a physical liquidation operation, a bloody logistical plot that would go down in history as the Pazzi conspiracy. With the covert sanction of the papacy, the Pazzi family resolved to eliminate the leadership echelon of the Medici to entirely eradicate their hegemony from the market. When the calendar struck April 26, 1478, assassins disguised as clergymen mobilized during Sunday Mass within the Santa Maria del Fiore Cathedral, in the heart of Florence. With flawless timing, the assault commenced at the most sacred moment of the liturgy, marked by the ringing of the bell. While Lorenzo's brother, Giuliano de' Medici, lost his life on the cathedral's marble floor, enduring 19 stab wounds, Lorenzo, sustaining a severe wound to the neck, managed to seek refuge in the north sacristy, Sagrestia Nord, locking the heavy wooden doors behind him and surviving. The physical assassination attempt ultimately failed as the Florentine populace rallied around the Medici, resulting in the Pazzi family administrators being hanged from the cathedral windows. The true devastating toll of this event, however, lay concealed within the accounting ledgers. The financial embargo initiated with the papacy escalated into direct warfare following the assassination. The Pope excommunicated Florence and dispatched the armies of the Kingdom of Naples against the city. The Medici Bank was forced to exhaust the last remaining gold reserves in its central vaults to finance the defense of Florence. This dramatic scarcity of cash and the loss of central control engineered the inevitable breaking point, driving branch managers in the distant corners of Europe to make fatal and impulsive decisions to sustain the bank's profitability. The bloody aftermath of the Pazzi conspiracy and the colossal liquidity crisis ignited by the loss of the papal accounts had irreversibly drained the vaults of the Florence headquarters. The invincible holding architecture that Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici had constructed with a flawless decentralized vision. At the dawn of the 15th century, isolating branches from one another behind legal firewalls, mutated into a death trap crumbling under its own weight as the century entered its final quarter. The collapse of this corporate structure was not precipitated by an external military blow, but from within, initiated when the weakest link of the system, the human element, namely the branch managers, slipped from control. Under the administration of Lorenzo de' Medici, who was heralded in the political arena as the Magnificent, Il Magnifico, yet entirely lacked the ruthless accounting discipline and logistical intellect of his ancestors, the ironclad rules of the bank were systematically violated. The auditing mechanism of the Florence headquarters had been paralyzed. The initial technical signal of the impending catastrophe was the cover-up of mathematical discrepancies in inter-branch fund transfers and an escalating liquidity crisis by Francesco Sassetti, who managed the Geneva and Lyon branches and simultaneously held the position of general manager, direttore generale. The truly devastating blow, however, was delivered from Bruges, the cold and calculating commercial capital of Northern Europe, driven by an ambition that transcended mere commercial profit, the desire to be accepted into the aristocratic circles of the Duchy of Burgundy and to amass personal prestige. Tommaso Portinari, the manager of the Bruges branch, breached the most inviolable rule: loans were never to be extended to monarchs. During this period, England had been dragged into a bloody and exhaustive dynastic struggle known as the Wars of the Roses. Harboring hopes of establishing an absolute monopoly over the export of English raw wool to the European mainland, Portinari extended colossal, unsecured loans to King Edward IV of England to finance his military campaigns. However, because the capital swallowed by the conflict never translated into any commercial activity, the probability of repayment was non-existent. When King Edward IV's treasury was exhausted, the anticipated yet logistically unmitigated absolute end materialized: sovereign default. Confronted with a kingdom's refusal to honor its debts, a Florentine bank branch possessed absolutely no legal or military power of enforcement. Once the English monarchy halted payments, those massive receivables in the ledgers of the Bruges branch transformed overnight into toxic, worthless figures. Capital valued at millions of gold florins had evaporated, and the bank's most critical liquidity pool in Northern Europe had been drained. Because the legal isolation mechanism had been breached by the indiscipline at the headquarters, the bankruptcy of Bruges spread like a contagion to the other accounts. The physical stockpiles of gold and silver required for the Lettera di Cambio network to function were depleted, and even papal funds were insufficient to keep this colossal wreckage afloat. In the shadow of this inevitable technical bankruptcy, as Lorenzo de' Medici and the bank's top executives watched their capital vanish, they initiated the largest and most costly public diplomacy maneuver in history to ensure their political survival. To conceal the impending collapse and render the family's legitimacy untouchable in the eyes of the public and the church, their contracting financial power had to be channeled into physical topography, into stone and paint. The final resources of a bank that could no longer finance Europe were diverted into cathedral domes, the construction of massive palaces, Palazzo Medici Riccardi, frescoes and sculptures. During this process, art was not a mere aesthetic pursuit or an act of polite patronage. It was directly deployed as a massive propaganda curtain, masking the bank's melting balance sheets, a tangible geopolitical shield. The brushstrokes of Botticelli, or the architectural genius of Brunelleschi, functioned as instruments of psychological warfare, marketing the illusion to the Florentine populace and foreign powers that the Medici family still resided in inexhaustible prosperity. While losing its power in the accounting ledgers, the family elevated its visual hegemony in the physical realm to an unprecedented scale. Ultimately, by the year 1494, that colossal financial machine, which had infiltrated the very capillaries of Europe, circumvented the prohibition of usury to turn time into currency, and clothed the entire continent through a chemical monopoly in the Tolfa mines, collapsed mathematically, and closed its doors permanently. Yet, the strategy of petrifying capital into stone achieved such flawless success that, as the Medici Bank sank into the darkness of bankruptcy, the architectural and artistic legacy they left behind engraved that era into the collective memory for centuries, not as an age of financial ruin, but under the title of the Renaissance, the most luminous period of rebirth in human history. That brings us to the end of our video. Thank you for joining us for tonight's story. If you enjoyed it and want to see more content like this, please don't forget to like and subscribe. We would also love to hear your ideas and suggestions in the comments, so we can keep creating even better content for you. Hope to see you in the next video.